In the dim pre-dawn light of June 6, 1944, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter peered through the narrow slit of his Normandy bunker, expecting another monotonous watch over the English Channel. But as the mist lifted, a chilling sight emerged, an endless armada of Allied ships, materializing on the horizon like a steel nightmare. From his fortified perch, Richter witnessed the dawn of DDay not as a conqueror, but as a man, realizing the Reich's invincibility was a fragile illusion. Join us inside the bunkers for a gripping German officer's perspective on the invasion that shattered Fortress Europe. Feel the tension build, the disbelief mount, and the crushing weight of history unfold in this untold story of shock and revelation. What he saw that morning didn't just signal the beginning of the end, it exposed the raw mathematics of defeat. Stay tuned. You won't look at World War II the same way again. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Infantry Division, the morning of June 6, 1944, started with the familiar chill of coastal Normandy. The air was thick with salt and damp earth, a gray mist clinging to the English Channel like a shroud. Stationed in a concrete bunker perched on a bluff overlooking what the Allies would soon call Omaha Beach, Richter adjusted his binoculars, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. At 32, he was a seasoned veteran, scarred by the brutal winters on the Eastern Front, where he'd seen the Red Army's relentless hordes grind German divisions to dust. Back then, he'd clung to the propaganda of unbreakable Aryan will, but experience had forged in him a pragmatic skepticism. Normandy felt different, quieter, almost deceptive in its serenity. His battery of artillery guns, checkmate howitzers, embedded in casemates a few miles inland, stood ready, their barrels silent sentinels against the sea. The men under his command, a mix of grizzled Eastern Front survivors and wide-eyed teenage conscripts, stirred in their bunks below, grumbling about another drill or false alarm. Richter lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the bunker's dim interior, casting shadows on maps pinned to the walls. These charts detailed the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted Fortress Europa, chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain, designed to repel any invasion with concrete, steel, and sheer engineering might. Propaganda films had shown it as an impenetrable barrier, bristling with machine guns, minefields, and artillery. The enemy will break like waves on our rocks, the reels boasted. But Richter knew better. He'd inspected the defenses himself, incomplete bunkers, gaps in the wire, and stretches where the wall was little more than a few pillboxes and barbed wire. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had raced along the coast in recent months, barking orders to fortify the beaches, with millions of mines and jagged steel obstacles dubbed Rommel's asparagus by the troops. Rommel understood what Berlin seemed to ignore. If the Allies gained a foothold, their air superiority would doom any counterattack. Defeat them on the beaches, he'd insisted, or lose the war. As the clock ticked past 5 a.m., Richter's thoughts drifted to the invasion rumors. Der Tag X, they called it the Day of Days. German intelligence was convinced the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing, where the 15th Army waited in force. Normandy, a backwater, perhaps a feint. This miscalculation was no fluke. It stemmed from Operation Fortitude, the Allies' masterful deception. Phantom armies, fake radio traffic, and double agents like Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo, fed the Germans lies about a Calais assault. Richter's division, though better equipped than most coastal units, was spread thin. Veterans like him, bolstered by reservists unfit for the front lines. They drilled endlessly, calculating firing solutions, maintaining ammunition stocks, and peering at the empty sea. Talk around the mess tables was laced with anxiety. When they come, a young private had whispered the night before, "We'll send them back to England in body bags." Richter had nodded, but inwardly, he wondered. The Americans and British weren't the disorganized foes of 1940. Reports from Africa and Italy spoke of their growing might. A storm had raged on June 5th, high winds whipping the channel into froth. The German Meteorological Service assured no invasion could launch in such conditions, impossible for days. This forecast lulled the high command into complacency. Rommel himself had departed for Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, confident the weather was their ally. Other officers attended training exercises or slept soundly. In the bunker, Richter's watch was routine. Check the field telephone, scan the horizon, sip bitter ersatz coffee. The storm had passed, leaving choppy seas, but no one expected trouble. He faced east, where dawn's first glow teased the sky. A flicker caught his eye, not a wave, not a patrol boat. He raised his Zeiss binoculars, heart quickening. There, where sea met sky, a dark line emerged, growing, sharpening. Ships, not a handful, but dozens, then hundreds. His breath caught, sweeping left and right. The view was the same, a solid mass of vessels, silhouettes of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and countless landing craft packed like sardines. Richter's mind reeled. This wasn't a raid, it was an armada, a floating city defying logic. German estimates pegged a maximum Allied fleet at 3,000 vessels a stretch. Even then, what sprawled before him was double that. Nearly 7,000 ships from 8 nations, the largest amphibious force ever assembled. Battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Warspite loomed, their turrets ominous. Swarms of destroyers darted protectively. Landing craft Higgins boats, LSTs, LC-is formed ranks, engines humming a low, menacing drone that vibrated through the air. Richter blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the image sharpened with the rising sun. A cold dread snaked up his spine. This was ITH invasion, not at Calais, but here, in Normandy. His hand trembled as he grabbed the field telephone. "This is Richter, at Observation Post 4. Visual, on the channel. Ships hundreds, thousands. The sea is covered horizon to horizon. This is the invasion." The voice on the other end was groggy, dismissive. "A few ships, Oberleutnant. Possible raid. Stand by." Richter's voice rose, strained. "No, you don't understand. It's not a few, it's the entire Allied Navy. Battleships, landing craft, everything." Alert headquarters. A pause. Then skepticism. "Sea conditions aren't suitable. Reports indicate otherwise." Frustration boiled over. "I'm looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea." He slammed the receiver down, cursing the chain of commands paralysis. Disbelief gripped them. Their intelligence, maps, and plans couldn't fathom this scale. While Richter stared at the fleet, High Command fixated on inland parachutist reports, Allied dummies, and SAS teams, sowing confusion. No one heeded the sea. Richter didn't wait. He bellowed orders to his men, rousing them from sleep. "To your posts." Invasion fleet sighted. Faces pale with awe and terror peered out. The drills kicked in. Shells hauled from magazines. Rangefinders shouting distances. The howitzers' barrels elevated, pointing seaward. Richter returned to his slit, binoculars pressed tight. Landing craft formed waves, bows cutting through swells. The air thrummed with engines, the breath of a superpower awakening. Permission came just before 6 a.m. "Engage at will. Fire," Richter roared. The ground shook as the first gun belched flame, shell arcing over the water. He tracked it. A plume rupted amid the fleet. Misadjustments followed. Disciplined volleys thundered. Pride surged as a hit struck the USS Corey, an American destroyer. Orange flash, black smoke. The ship listed, crippled. Later sinking accounts debate mine versus artillery, but from Richter's view, his guns claimed first blood. Cheers echoed in the bunker, but triumph faded fast. The fleet didn't falter. Gaps filled seamlessly. For every harassed vessel, hundreds pressed NN. Iron tide, unstoppable. Futility washed over Richter. His battery, potent as it was a pebble against the ocean. Beyond his impacts, Allied battleships turned turrets shoreward. A rumble grew, flashes like distant lightning. Seconds later, the world erupted. Earth geysers, ground heaving, air tearing. Naval bombardment commenced. Systematic demolition of the Atlantic Wall. Shells from 14-inch guns pounded positions, dust raining in the bunker. Where was the German response? Richter scanned skies empty of Luftwaffe, swarming with Allied planes, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-17s, C-47s, ferrying paratroopers. Luftwaffe sorties that day, barely 300 across France. Allies over 14,000. Air supremacy was total. Panzers, the 21st Division nearby, idled, awaiting Hitler's personal order. Futile in this chaos. When they moved, Allied fighter bombers shredded them. Richter grasped it. This wasn't a battle, it was extermination. Allies didn't outmaneuver, they overwhelmed. His mind shifted from tactics to systems. Through binoculars, he envisioned Detroit's assembly lines, churning ships, tanks, planes, America's industrial might. 29,000 tanks in 1944 alone, versus Germany's peak 2,000 monthly. Sherman's outnumbered Tigers 10-1. Quantity trumping quality. C-47s streamed endlessly. Logistics supplied hundreds of thousands seamlessly. Ideology Nazi willpower. Unified Volk. Dissolved against numbers. A mathematical lie, Richter thought. Despair deepening. Propaganda promised triumph over decadent democracies. But here was proof. Factories won wars, not fervor. As bombardment intensified, bunkers shuddering, Richter watched Higgins' boats hit Omaha. Ramps dropped. Americans charged into machine gun fire. Water reddened. Boadies piled the 352nd exacted tolls, pinning invaders. For moments, defenses held. Then, industrial equation reasserted. Destroyers steamed suicidally close. Hulls scraping sand. Guns blasting bunkers. Point-blank turning tide. Amphibious DUKWS emerged from surf. Hobart's funniest flail tanks detonating mines. Bridging vehicles overcame obstacles Germans lacked counters for. Richter's battery became targets. Shells landed nearer. A gun pit exploded in fireball. Lines dead. Isolated. He glanced skyward. Ceiling of Allied aircraft. Seas teemed with waves of craft. Armada waited like a conveyor belt. 1,500 Allied tanks landed that day. Beach battle raged, but outcome sealed. Time and tonnage favored invaders. For Richter War's epilogue began. Hope vanished in dawn's light. The Third Reich's end, often seen as Berlin's fall, crystallized here for Atlantic wallmen. In one horrifying revelation, a horizon-filling fleet, enemy-dominated sky, modern industries crushing weight. A new war, won on distant assembly lines. The sun climbed, bombardment crescendoed, thunder unending. Through the slit, Richter saw first waves hit shore. Higgins' boats beached, ramps slamming down. Disgorging G is into hell. Machine guns and pillboxes chattered, mowing ranks. From vantage, drama unfolded. Surf foaming red, men crumpling. 352nd inflicted horror estimates. 4,000 American casualties on Omaha. Pinned down, invasion teetered, but Allies adapted. Destroyers, seeing slaughter, charged beachward 1,000 yards. Keels grinding sand. Guns roared direct fire, silencing front points. Heroic madness turned stalemate. Meanwhile, specialized gear appeared. DUKWs, driving from ocean tanks with flails, whipping chains to explode mines. Petard tanks blasting concrete. Crocodile flamethrowers, incinerating positions. British ingenuity, Hobart's brainchild, designed for this. Germans had no equals. Richter's guns fired desperately, but incoming shells zeroed in. Direct hit vaporized a casemate. Men screamed. Acrid smoke-filled air. Telephone silent. Command fractured. Isolated. He pondered broader canvas. Paratroopers inland 8nd, 101st Airborne seized roads, bridges, sowing chaos. German reserves, like Panzer Lehr, bogged down by air attacks. Fuel shortages. Hitler's no-retreat doctrine doomed flexibility. Deeper, Richter confronted spiritual void. Good soldier, dutiful, yet dying not from outfighting but outnumbering. Finely crafted Panthers versus Sherman Swarm's elegance versus mass Nazi dream. Will-conquering material. Reality, bombers, battleships, indifferent to ideology. Suicides rose among officers, confronting impossible truth. War raged 2 more months in Normandy bocage, fighting brutal, costly, but gaps unfilled for Germans. Allies replaced losses thrice over. For Richter's survivor's duty, fear drove on but victory's spark extinguished. June 6th. We picture Reich's collapse as gradual agony to Berlin, but for bunkermen, end flashed in dawn. Fleet bending horizon, planes blackening sky, industrial juggernaut unleashed. Not hearts of soldiers, but factory gears, sealed fate. For one officer, binoculars to steal sea, morning of knowing doom. As the hours dragged on, Richter's bunker became a cauldron of noise and chaos. The constant barrage from the Allied fleet turned the bluff into a moonscape of craters. Each impact sent shockwaves through the reinforced concrete, dislodging chunks from the ceiling that rained down like gravel. The air grew thick with dust and cordite, stinging eyes and throats. His men, faces smeared with grime, worked frantically to keep the remaining guns operational. Ammunition dwindled. One howitzer jammed, its crew cursing as they fought to clear the breach. Richter moved between positions, barking encouragement, but his words felt hollow, even to himself. The initial defiance, the cheer when the quarry went down, had evaporated under the relentless pounding. Now it was survival, raw and mechanical, through the observation slit, now cracked from near misses. Richter watched the beach transform into a slaughterhouse-turned-assembly line. The first waves of Americans lay scattered in the surf and on the shingle, but fresh boats kept coming, wave after wave, as predictable as the tide. The German machine gunners in the wider stands nested. The resistance nests poured fire into the attackers. MG-42s rattled at 1,200 rounds per minute, their distinctive buzzsaw sound echoing across the water. For a time, it seemed the defense might hold. Omaha Beach earned its bloody reputation that morning. American casualties mounted horrifically, entire companies shredded before reaching the seawall. Richter allowed himself a grim satisfaction. His division was fighting like lions. The 352nd, trained and positioned better than most static units, was making the invaders pay dearly. Yet even as the defenders inflicted punishment, the Allies refused to break. Richter saw it clearly. This wasn't 1940, when panic and poor coordination had doomed France. These soldiers, though green, pressed forward under fire. Medics dragged wounded to cover. Engineers blasted gaps and obstacles with Bangalore torpedoes. And always, the Navy was there. Those daring destroyers, now legends in their own right, hugged the shoreline. The USS Frankfurt, USS McCook, others Richter couldn't name. They raked the bluffs with 5-inch guns, shells screaming in at point-blank range. One by one, pillboxes fell silent. Concrete erupted in geysers of dust and rebar. A direct hit on a neighboring Tobruk position sent a plume of smoke skyward, along with fragments that rattled against Richter's bunker like hail. Then came the air. If the sea belonged to the ships, the sky was an Allied empire. Typhoons and thunderbolts roared overhead, rocket pods glinting under wings. They dove on inland batteries, on roads where German reinforcements tried to move. Richter knew the 21st Panzer Division was somewhere behind him, but they might as well have been on the moon. Jabos allied fighter bombers onto the daylight. Any vehicle showing itself drew immediate attack. The Luftwaffe, a joke that day. Göring's promises of thousands of planes evaporated. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and Allied deception kept them grounded or ineffective. Richter spotted perhaps, to me, 109s, the entire morning. Fleeting shadows chased away by inside the bunker, morale cracked. A young conscript, barely 17, vomited in the corner after a shell landed close enough to burst eardrums. An older reservist muttered prayers, clutching a photo of his family. Richter felt the weight of command heavier than ever. He thought of his own wife and daughter in Hamburg, letters he'd written but never sent with the truth of his doubts. The propaganda back home spoke of wonder weapons jets V2 South, new submarines that would turn the tide. But here, on this bluff, facing the reality of 1944, those felt like fairy tales. The wonder weapon the Allies had was production. Simple, brutal, unstoppable. As midday approached, the tide, literal and figurative, shifted decisively. Naval fire and air attacks had suppressed enough strong points for the Americans to gain the seawall. Engineers cleared paths through minefields under covering fire. Ranger units scaled the cliffs at Point Duhok, though Richter couldn't see that far. On Omaha, survivors of the first waves rallied. The specialized tanks DD Shermans that swam ashore, though many sank, began to make a difference where they reached land. Flails whipped chains to detonate mines. Bridgelayers spanned obstacles. Richter watched in bitter fascination as a Churchill Avra fired its petard mortar, the massive charge blowing a hole in a concrete emplacement that had held out for hours. His own battery fell silent, gun by gun. The last operational howitzers scored a lucky hit on a landing craft, flames blooming as ammunition cooked off. But retaliation was swift. A barrage from a cruiser bracketed the position. Richter ordered his men to the deeper shelters as the world outside became inferno. When the dust settled, he emerged to survey the damage. 2 guns destroyed, crews gone or wounded. The bluff smoked. Neighboring bunkers were tombs. Through drifting haze, he saw American flags small, at first appearing on the beach below. Not many, but enough. The foothold was secured. In that moment, Richter's realization crystallized into something beyond tactical defeat. It was existential. The Atlantic Wall, Rommel's desperate improvements, the blood of his men, all for a delay of hours. The Allies would build up faster than Germany could respond. Mulberry harbors were already en route, artificial ports to sustain the invasion, pipelines under the ocean. Pluto would feed the beast fuel. Airfields would sprout in days. Every lost panther or tiger was irreplaceable. Every Sherman was just another shift at the factory. He thought of the broader war. The Eastern Front bled the Wehrmacht dry. Now the West opened fully. Bombers ravaged cities nightly. Italy was lost. The Reich fought on multiple fronts against enemies whose resources dwarfed its own. Hitler's refusal to trade space for time, his no-retreat orders, ensured maximum casualties for minimum gain. Richter, a professional soldier, saw the madness clearly now. They weren't defending the fatherland. They were sacrificing for a regime that had gambled everything on early victories and lost. As evening fell on June 6th, Richter sat in the ruined bunker, sharing a last cigarette with survivors. The bombardment had eased. The beach had held. Distant gunfire echoed inland, where paratroopers and rangers fought. Tomorrow would bring counterattacks, furious, costly, futile. The 21st Panzer would throw itself against a lodgment and be repulsed. Panzer Lehr and 12th SS would arrive too late, to piecemeal, shredded by air power. Richter stared at the channel, now dotted with ships unloading under searchlights. The armada hadn't diminished. It grew, a conveyor belt of war material that could run for months, years if needed. He felt no hatred for the Americans struggling ashore, soldiers like him, doing their duty. The anger was reserved for the architects of this disaster, safe in Berlin or Rastenburg, feeding delusions to a nation. For men like Klaus Richter, June 6th wasn't just the longest day, it was the clearest. The day the veil lifted, revealing not a winnable war, but a prolonged execution. Duty would keep them fighting through Normandy's bocage, through Falaise's carnage, through the retreat across France. Some would die, some surrender, a few survived to captivity or bitter peace. But hope, the genuine belief in victory, died that morning, in bunkers along the Normandy coast. It died watching a horizon filled with steel, a sky owned by the enemy, and an industrial reality no amount of courage could overcome. The Third Reich's fate was sealed not in Berlin's ruins 11 months later, but in the dawn light of June 6, 1944, when men peering through concrete slits saw the full measure of their enemy's power, and knew, with terrible clarity, that the war was already lost. The bunker was eerily quiet now, the guns silent, the telephone line dead. Richter stepped outside into the fading light, the air heavy with the acrid stench of burned powder and scorched earth. The bluff looked like the surface of another planet, craters overlapping craters, twisted rebar jutting from shattered concrete, the remnants of Rommel's asparagus scattered like broken teeth along the beach below. Smoke drifted in lazy columns from ruined positions. Somewhere a wounded man cried out, his voice thin and hopeless against the distant crash of surf. Richter lit another cigarette with shaking hands, the match flaring briefly to reveal the exhaustion etched into his face. He was covered in dust, uniform torn, but alive for now. From his vantage point, the scale of the Allied achievement became undeniable. The channel, which had been a gray void that morning, now teemed with purposeful activity. Landing craft shuttled back and forth like worker ants, ferrying men, vehicles, and supplies to the growing beachhead. Bulldozers and engineers worked under floodlights as dusk deepened, clearing paths, building roads, unloading crates stamped with American markings. Mulberry components, massive concrete caissons, and floating piers were already being towed into position. The first pieces of the artificial harbors that would turn this hostile shore into a functioning port Richter had read intelligence reports dismissing such ideas as fantasy. Now he watched the fantasy become engineering reality before his eyes. Inland, the sounds of battle shifted. Sporadic artillery duels, the chatter of small arms fire, the occasional roar of aircraft engines. The American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne had secured key objectives, despite scattered drops, causeways, bridges, villages. British and Canadian forces to the east had pushed farther inland than expected. The German counterattacks, when they came, were piecemeal and uncoordinated. The 21st Panzer Division launched probes toward the British sector, but achieved little before withdrawing under air attack. Orders from higher headquarters were contradictory, delayed, sometimes non-existent. Hitler's insistence on personal approval for armored movements, his fear of another Dunkirk betrayal, paralyzed the response exactly when speed mattered most. Richter thought of Rommel hundreds of kilometers away in Herrlingen, receiving the news by telephone. The Desert Fox would race back to France the next day, but it was already too late. His warnings about defeating the invasion on the beaches had been prophetic, yet ignored by the Führer's inner circle. Rundstedt, Rommel's superior, had famously remarked months earlier that the war was lost unless peace could be made. Now even that grim realism seemed optimistic. As night fully descended, Richter returned to the bunker. His surviving men gathered around a dim lantern, sharing the last of their rations: hard bread, ersatz coffee. A few cigarettes passed hand to hand. Conversation was muted. No one spoke of victory anymore. Instead, they talked of practicalities, ammunition counts, wounded to evacuate, whether the next barrage would find them. A sergeant, a veteran like Richter from the Eastern Front, voiced what everyone felt. "They have everything," he said quietly. "Planes, ships, tanks, fuel, endless. We have concrete and orders not to retreat." Richter nodded but said nothing. He was thinking of the numbers again. The cold mathematics that had revealed itself that morning. America alone had entered 1944, producing more aircraft than the entire Axis combined. Its shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Its factories turned out Shermans at a rate that made German panzer production look artisanal. Add Britain's Commonwealth resources, the Soviet Union's relentless output despite staggering losses, and the picture was complete. The Reich was fighting the world's industrial capacity with ideology and dwindling reserves. Raw materials were choked by blockade and bombing, fuel shortages, grounded planes, and immobilized divisions. Experienced pilots and tank crews had been spent in earlier campaigns, replaced by boys barely trained. Richter had seen the future that morning, and it was tonnage, not courage, not tactical brilliance, not even the feared wonder weapons still in development. Tonnage of steel, fuel, explosives, food, delivered across an ocean, and now, across this beach. The Allies could afford mistakes. Germany could not. Every position lost was permanent. Every experienced officer, or NCO killed, left a gap no replacement could fill. The war had become a contest of attrition against enemies who could replace losses almost indefinitely. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by the rumble of distant bombing and the occasional flare lighting the sky. Richter dreamed of assembly lines' endless belts, carrying half-finished tanks, ships sliding downways into rivers, crates of ammunition, rolling toward waiting trains. He woke with the taste of defeat, metallic in his mouth. The days that followed blurred into a grim routine. Richter's battery, reduced to a single operational gun, harassed the beachhead as best it could before being finally silenced on June 8th. He and his men withdrew inland under cover of darkness, joining the patchwork defense that would become the Normandy campaign. The fighting in the Bocage country was savage hedgerow ambushes, village massacres, relentless air attacks. German soldiers fought with skill and desperation, exacting a heavy price for every kilometer, but the outcome never changed. Reinforcements arrived for the Allies in division strength, for the Germans in battalions, often without fuel or air support. Richter survived the campaign, retreating across France as the front collapsed in August. He saw the Falaise pocket from afar, the carnage of encircled German armies under non-stop air assault. He marched through Paris's liberation, evading capture. By winter he was on the Western Front again, fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, or perhaps the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, that achieved nothing but further exhaustion. But whatever battles came later, Richter carried June 6th with him always. That single morning when the mist lifted and revealed, not just an invasion, but the full, unmasked power of the enemy. Not soldiers alone, but the system behind them. Factories humming across an ocean. Workers in Detroit and Coventry and Leningrad, building the tools of victory, while German cities burned. A war decided not by the will of one man in a bunker, but by the collective output of democracies and dictatorships alike, that had mobilized their entire societies. For the men who stood on the Atlantic Wall that dawn, history often reduces them to statistics: defenders overwhelmed, casualties inflicted. But for Klaus Richter and thousands like him, June 6th was profoundly personal. It was the moment clarity replaced illusion. The moment they understood they were not merely outnumbered on a battlefield, but outmatched by a world. The moment they realized the war had been lost long before the first shell fell on Normandy, not on the beaches, but on production charts and resource tables years earlier. The Third Reich would fight on for 11 more months, driven by terror, loyalty, and denial. Millions more would die. Cities would be reduced to rubble. But for those who peered through binoculars at a sea turned to steel on the morning of June 6th, 1944, the end arrived in a single, terrible revelation. It was not rage or despair they felt most acutely in that moment. It was recognition. The recognition of an equation already solved, a verdict already rendered. The recognition that courage, duty, and sacrifice, noble as they work, could not alter mathematics. And in the quiet that followed the guns, as the greatest invasion in history secured its foothold just miles away, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood in the ruins of his bunker and accepted the truth. The war was over. It had ended the instant the horizon filled with ships, and all that remained was the long, bloody epilogue. The days blurred into weeks, and Richter found himself deeper in the Normandy countryside, commanding what remained of his battered unit amid the dense bocage hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. The retreat was orderly at first, German discipline holding even in defeat, but the pressure never relented. Allied fighter bombers, those hated jabos, prowled the skies like hawks, striking any movement in daylight. Columns of vehicles became death traps. Soldiers learned to scatter at the first drone of vengeance. Richter's men marched mostly at night, exhausted, hungry, their boots worn through. Ammunition arrived sporadically, fuel even less. The once proud Wehrmacht was reduced to scavenging from abandoned depots and fallen comrades. He witnessed the arrival of elite reinforcements, Panzer Lehr, the 12th SS Hitler Jugend divisions packed with veterans and fanatics. For a moment, hope flickered. Counterattacks near Cannes and Villers-Bocage showed flashes of the old blitzkrieg brilliance. Michael Wittmann's Lone Tiger ambushing a British column, destroying dozens of tanks in minutes. But these were pinpricks against the flood. The Allies absorbed the blows and pressed on, their artillery now ashore in overwhelming strength. Typhoons with rocket pods turned panzer assemblies into graveyards. The Falaise Gap in August became the culmination, a pocket where entire armies were encircled and pulverized from the air. Richter's unit skirted the edges, watching columns of smoke rise like funeral pyres. Tens of thousands surrendered or died there. The Western Front's backbone shattered. By September, Richter was part of the headlong retreat across France. Paris fell amid jubilation for the liberators and quiet shame for the occupiers. Belgian and French towns that had flown swastikas now cheered Allied columns. German stragglers faced hostility, Maquis ambushes, summary executions for SS men. Richter discarded insignia where he could, blending into the gray masses of defeated soldiers streaming eastward. He crossed the Siegfried Line in autumn, the west wall that was supposed to be another impenetrable barrier. It was as incomplete as the Atlantic Wall had been, riddled with gaps and manned by Volkssturm. Militia's old men and boys pressed into service. Winter brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble through the snowy forests. Richter, reassigned to a depleted artillery regiment, supported the initial breakthrough. For a few days, it felt like 1940 again. American units, surprised. Roads clogged with retreating GIs. The surprise at Normandy, where SS troops massacred prisoners. but the momentum stalled. Fuel ran dry. Air support never materialized. Once the skies cleared, Allied planes returned in force, turning the bulge into another cauldron. Bastogne held. Patton's relief punched through. The offensive cost Germany its last reserves, tanks, planes, experienced crews that could never be replaced. Richter survived the retreat again, pulled back to the Rhine. He watched the great river bridges blow, one by one, denying the Allies easy crossings, but also trapping remnants on the wrong side. Remagen's capture an intact bridge, seized by a daring American thrust sealed the fate of the West. By March 1945, Allied armies poured into the Reich's heartland. Cities Richter had known as a Boykentil Dusseldorf Issenley, in ruins from years of bombing. The industrial Ruhr, cradle of German war production, fell almost without fight. In the final weeks, Richter ended up defending some nameless village on the Elbe approaches. His unit was a shadow boys with Panzerfaust's wounded veterans, foreign volunteers who barely spoke German. Orders came to hold at all costs, fight to the last man. Fanatical Gallaters threatened courts-martial for any retreat, but the will had eroded. Soldiers listened to foreign radio broadcasts, whispered about the Führer's madness. Desertions increased. Richter himself destroyed his paybook and party card, preparing for capture rather than pointless death. When the Americans finally overran his position in April, Richter surrendered without firing a shot. The G is well fed, equipped with endless supplies, driving brand new vehicles treated prisoners correctly, almost indifferently. In a POW camp, he learned of Hitler's suicide, Berlin's fall, the unconditional surrender on May 8th. The war that had seemed endless ended abruptly, like a machine switched off. In the years that followed, Richter lived quietly in the shattered Germany of occupation and reconstruction. He worked rebuilding roads, then in a factory ironic, producing consumer goods on assembly lines that echoed the ones he'd feared in 1944. He rarely spoke of the war, but when he did, with old comrades over beer, the conversation always returned to that single morning on the Normandy bluff. June 6, 1944. The mist lifting, the horizon darkening with ships. The moment everything became clear. Not the battles, not the retreats, not even the surrendered. That dawn was the true end. Everything after was consequence. The slow unwinding of a decision already made across oceans and factories. The mathematics had spoken, and no amount of German courage, ingenuity, or sacrifice could rebut it. For Richter, and for countless others who stood in bunkers along 5 beaches that day, history's greatest invasion wasn't remembered as the Allies' triumph alone. It was remembered as the morning the illusion shattered, the morning a professional soldier looked at the future and saw, with perfect, terrible clarity, that his side had already lost. The war continued because men like him did their duty. But belief, fire that fuels armies, died in the cold light of a Channel dawn, when a sea of gray water turned into a sea of steel, and the full, crushing weight of the modern world bore down on Fortress Europe. And in that revelation, amid the thunder of guns and the screams of the dying, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter understood the deepest truth of the Second World War. It wasn't won by generals or politicians or even soldiers in the field. It was won by factories, by workers on 3 shifts in Detroit and Coventry and Chelyabinsk, by shipyards and oil fields and rail networks that never stopped, by an industrial civilization fully mobilized, producing not just weapons, but inevitability. That was the sight that greeted him on June 6, 1944, through Zeiss binoculars from a concrete bunker on a Normandy bluff. Not an invasion, a verdict. And for one German officer, staring at a horizon that no longer ended at the sea, but stretched all the way to the assembly lines of America, it was the moment he knew beyond doubt, beyond hope, beyond denial, that the 1,000-year Reich would not survive the year. The guns roared on, the beaches burned, history marched forward. But in his heart, the war was already over. In the quiet years after the war, Richter rarely spoke of Normandy to his family. His daughter grew up knowing only vague stories of the front, of cold winters and long marches. His wife sensed the shadow, but never pressed. He worked steadily, rebuilding what bombs and defeats had torn down, first literal bricks in the Trümmerfrauen clearing rubble, then in factories producing cars and appliances for the Wirtschaftswunder. The same assembly lines that had haunted his dreams now employed him, turning out Volkswagens instead of Tigers. Irony, he thought sometimes. But mostly he felt relief. Survival had been the victory. Occasionally, on June 6th, he would wake before dawn, the old habit unbroken. He would stand at the window of their modest apartment, watching the sky lighten over rebuilt streets. No mist, no channel, no armada, just the quiet hum of a peaceful Germany rising for work. But in his mind, the horizon always darkened again. The ships always appeared. He could still feel the vibration in the concrete, hear the low drone of engines, taste the dust and fear. He followed the histories as they emerged. Books, documentaries, the slow opening of archives. He learned details he'd never known in the bunker. Eisenhower's agonizing weather decision, the deception operations that had fixed German reserves at Calais, the staggering logistics, millions of tons shipped across the Atlantic, Pluto pipelines pumping fuel under the channel, mulberries functioning despite storms. He read of the human cost. The boys drowned in sunken DD tanks, the Rangers scaling Point Duhok under fire, the Canadian sacrifices at Juno. He felt no triumph in their losses, only the shared tragedy of young men fed into war's machinery. Richter visited Normandy once, in the 1970s, with a veterans group. The beaches were peaceful tourists, children building sandcastles, memorials gleaming white against green cliffs. The bunkers remained, weathered but intact, now museums with explanatory plaques. He stood in one similar to his own, peering through the same narrow slit toward the sea. The view was unchanged, the same curve of sand, the same rise and fall of tides, but the horizon was empty. No steel city floating toward him. He felt an unexpected peace. The ghosts were there, but quieter now. He met American veterans, that day former GIs, who had stormed Omaha, now gray-haired like him. They shared cigarettes, awkward at first, then easier. Language barriers fell away in gestures and shared understanding. One man, a former sergeant from the 1st Infantry Division, clapped him on the shoulder. "Hell of a fight," he said in halting German. Richter nodded. "Ja, hell of a fight. No blame, no hatred, just recognition of duty, done on opposite sides of the same madness." Later, alone on the bluff, Richter thought about what he would say if asked the question historians loved. When did Germany lose the war? Moscow 1941, Stalingrad, the bombing campaign. The answer, for him, was simpler and more personal. Germany lost the war on the morning of June 6, 1944, when the mist lifted over the English Channel and revealed not an invasion force that could be defeated, but an industrial reality that could not be matched. Not lost through cowardice or betrayal, as the old myths claimed. Not lost because of Allied luck or German mistakes alone. Lost because the world had changed. Modern war was no longer decided by the courage of soldiers or the genius of generals. It was decided by production lines, by resources, by the ability to sustain loss and keep coming. The Allies had built a system that could absorb Normandy's bloody cost and still grow stronger. Germany had built a system that could not. Richter returned home, changed by that visit. He began speaking more openly, not to glorify or justify, but to explain. To his grandchildren, he told the story, not of battles won or lost, but of a morning when he understood the true nature of the war they were fighting. He spoke of the ships, endless as far as the eye could see, of the sky filled with planes that never seemed to end, of the realization that courage alone was not enough against such weight. He died in the 1990s, peacefully, surrounded by family. On his nightstand was a small framed photograph, not of Hitler or military glory, but of the Normandy coast as it looked on a quiet summer day, decades later. Calm sea, empty horizon. The story of D-Day is often told as the greatest amphibious assault in history, the turning point that liberated Europe, and it was. But for the men inside the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, for Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and thousands like him, it was something more intimate. It was the moment the future arrived, not with fanfare or ideology, but with the quiet inevitability of mathematics, made manifest in steel. The moment they looked across the water and saw, not enemies, but the full measure of what opposed them. The moment they understood, not with anger, not with despair, but with the clear-eyed recognition of professionals, that the contest was decided, that all the fighting left to do was epilogue, that the war had ended, truly ended, in the dawn light of June 6, 1944, when a German officer in a concrete bunker on a Normandy bluff raised his binoculars to the horizon and watched his world change forever. The legacy of that morning lingered in Richter's mind like an indelible scar, a reference point for every reflection on war, power, and human folly in the decades that followed. He watched as Germany rose from ashes, the Marshall Plan pouring in the same kind of industrial aid that had once overwhelmed the Reich, now rebuilding it. American loans, British restraint, Soviet occupation in the East all part of the new equation. He saw the Cold War unfold, the division of his country into two states, the wall that rose in 1961 and fell in 1989. Ironies abounded. Former enemies became allies against a new threat. The factories that had produced Shermans now supplying NATO, while the East mirrored Soviet mass production. Richter never joined veterans associations that romanticized the past. He avoided reunions where old comrades toasted what might have been, or blamed stab-in-the-back myths. He knew better. The defeat hadn't come from treason or weakness, but from reality, from mismatched scales of power that no amount of valor could balance. When young historians or journalists sought him out in later years, asking for interviews, he granted few, but when he did speak, his words were measured, devoid of bitterness. The invasion was not a surprise in the sense of being unexpected. He told one interviewer, in the 1980s, "We knew it would come. The surprise was the scale, not just the ships or the planes, but what they represented. We were fighting the entire productive capacity of half the world. Our leaders told us will and spirit would prevail, but spirit doesn't stop a 14-inch shell. Will doesn't build a tank when you have no steel or fuel." He emphasized the human element to the shared ordeal of soldiers on both sides. The Americans who came ashore that day were brave men. Many died before they reached the sand. We respected them, even as we fired. War is not hatred between soldiers. It is hatred between systems, between choices made far from the front. In his final years, Richter took quiet satisfaction in the peace that endured. No more horizons filling with armadas, no more dawns heralding doom. Europe united, Germany whole again, the beaches of Normandy, places of remembrance, rather than battle. He followed anniversaries on television world, leaders gathering at cemeteries, veterans fewer each year, laying wreaths under clear skies. He noted how the narratives evolved. Less about glory, more about reconciliation. The lesson, slowly absorbed, was that overwhelming force had ended one war and, paradoxically, enabled the long peace that followed. When Richter passed away in the spring of 1998, his obituary was brief. A former officer, survivor of Normandy, rebuilt his life in peace. No mention of heroics or regrets. At his request, no military honors. His ashes were scattered on a quiet hillside overlooking the Rhine, not the Channel, but close enough to moving water. The story of Oberleutnant Klaus Richter is not unique. Thousands of German officers and soldiers along the Atlantic Wall experienced similar moments of revelation on June 6, 1944. Some fought on with grim determination. Some surrendered early. Some took their own lives in despair. But for all who witnessed the Armada's arrival, that morning marked a dividing line in their lives. The day illusion met reality head-on. History remembers D-Day as the beginning of Europe's liberation, a triumph of democracy over tyranny, the moment the tide turned decisively against Hitler, and rightly so. But from inside the bunkers, from the narrow observation slits facing the sea, it was also the moment the defenders understood the full depth of their predicament. Not a tactical setback, not a temporary reversal, but the visible, tangible proof that the war was irretrievable, that the Third Reich's ambitions had collided with a force greater than any army, the mobilized industry of free nations, backed by resources and resolve that simply outmatched anything a continental dictatorship could muster. The guns fell silent eventually. The beaches were secured. The breakout came. Paris liberated. the Rhine crossed, Berlin taken. But for the men who stood watch that dawn, the true end came earlier. It came with the lifting of the mist, with the darkening of the horizon, with the slow, inexorable realization that what approached was not merely an invasion force. It was destiny, forged in steel and delivered across the Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944. And in that moment of awful clarity, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, like so many others in concrete bunkers along the Normandy coast, lowered his binoculars, felt the ground tremble beneath the first salvos, and knew with a certainty deeper than fear or duty that the war was over. Everything that followed was simply the world catching up to what they had already seen. As decades passed, the memory of that dawn never truly faded for Richter. It became the lens through which he viewed the world, a quiet reminder of how fragile illusions of power can be when confronted by overwhelming reality. He watched the Cold War's arms race with a veteran's weary eye, superpowers stockpiling weapons not for battlefield glory, but for mutual deterrence. Nuclear arsenals grew to levels that made Normandy's armada seem quaint, yet the lesson remained the same. Victory belonged to the side that could sustain production, logistics, and resolve. Over time, he saw younger generations protest wars in Vietnam, march against missiles in Europe, demand peace in ways his own era never could. Some called them soft. Richter understood. They had learned from history's horrors what his generation discovered too late. Modern war devours everything lives, resources, futures without discrimination. Better to prevent than endure. In his final interview, recorded shortly before his death, Richter spoke directly to the camera. His voice was steady, eyes clear. People ask if we knew the war was lost earlier. Some say Stalingrad, some the bombing. For me, it was June 6th. Not because the beaches fell, that was inevitable once the ships appeared, but because in that moment, I saw the truth. We were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting factories, systems, an entire way of organizing the world that we could not match. He paused, gazing out a window toward distant hills. The Allies did not win because they were braver. Many of our men fought to the last bullet. They won because they could replace every bullet, every tank, every plane, every man lost. We could not. That is the hard lesson of 1944. Courage matters. Skill matters. But in total war, industry decides. Richter ended with words that stayed with the interviewer long after. Tell young people this. Never start a war you cannot finish with more than just will. Never believe ideology can overcome mathematics. And never underestimate what free people, working together across oceans, can achieve when their survival demands it. When he died, the world barely noticed one more veteran of a fading war. But for those who knew his story, Richter embodied something profound. The quiet dignity of a man who faced history's largest invasion, not with denial or rage, but with acceptance. He carried the weight of that morning to his grave, not as bitterness, but as wisdom. Today, on the Normandy beaches, visitors walk past bunkers like the one Richter commanded. Children play in the sand where blood once flowed. Tour guides recount the heroism of the attackers, the tragedy of the defenders. Monuments stand silent under changing skies, and on certain misty mornings, when the light is just right and the channel lies calm, it's possible to imagine standing in a concrete slit, binoculars raised, watching the horizon, waiting, expecting emptiness, seeing, instead, the future arriving in waves of steel. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for every German soldier who manned the Atlantic Wall on June 6, 1944, that was the defining moment of the war. Not the gunfire, not the landings, not even the eventual surrender, but the quiet, terrible instant when the mist parted, the ships appeared, and the truth became undeniable. The invasion had begun, the war had ended, and history, vast and inexorable, had chosen its course. This was the view from inside the bunker. On the morning everything changed. The moment a German officer realized, not with panic, not with despair, but with the cold clarity of a professional soldier, that the Third Reich's fate was sealed, that the greatest amphibious assault in human history was not just an attack on beaches. It was the physical manifestation of victory already won elsewhere in shipyards and factories, in democracies mobilized, in a world aligned against tyranny. It was the morning the horizon filled with ships, and for one man peering through Zeiss lenses from a Normandy bluff. It was the morning he knew. The Reich was doomed. Europe would be free, and the war, in its deepest sense, was already over. Thank you for joining this journey into one of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century from the other side of the beaches. If these stories of history's hidden perspectives move you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the human experiences behind the battles. Like, comment, and share what moment in World War II changed everything for you. The dawn of June 6, 1944, reminds us still, sometimes, the most important battles are fought long before the first shot is fired, and sometimes, the clearest defeats are recognized not in retreat, but in the first light of revelation.